In a world where everything blooms in haste, one garden remained barren, until patience brought forth a beauty that would change hearts forever. It was a morning like no other. The air was fresh, kissed by the dew of a passing night, and the sun began its slow ascent, casting a golden hue across the valley. Jesus and his disciples made their way up a hillside overlooking a vast landscape. The beauty of the olive trees, the vineyards, and the wildflowers seemed to mirror the disciples' joy at being with their master. Each step they took brought them closer to the top, and with each step the disciples felt a deeper sense of peace. As they approached the summit, their eyes were drawn to a peculiar sight. In the middle of this lush paradise was a barren patch of land, lifeless, cracked soil with no signs of growth. The contrast was stark and unsettling. The disciples whispered among themselves, wondering why this piece of earth had resisted the life flourishing around it. Peter, never one to hold back his thoughts, was the first to speak. "Master," he asked, pointing to the barren patch, "why does this land not bloom like the rest? Has it not received the same rain and sunlight as the others?" The other disciples nodded in agreement, curiosity filling their hearts. They had grown accustomed to seeing the miracles that followed Jesus, where life seemed to spring forth from nothing, and abundance appeared where there was lack. How could this piece of earth, under the same sky, remain untouched by the beauty surrounding it? Jesus, with his ever-present grace, smiled warmly. He saw the eagerness in their eyes, the same eagerness that often led them to misunderstand the deeper workings of God's timing. He knew their hearts longed for the kingdom of heaven, for the fruition of their efforts, for their faith to bear fruit quickly. He sensed that they, like many others, struggled with the idea of waiting, of nurturing something unseen, and of believing in a promise that had yet to bloom. "Come," Jesus said softly, motioning for them to sit around him. They gathered in a circle, their eyes still drawn to the barren soil. The morning breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers, but the air around the patch of land seemed still, waiting. Jesus took a deep breath and began, his voice a blend of tenderness and wisdom. "Many years ago, there was a gardener who loved the soil more than anything in the world. He cared for his land with unwavering devotion. Every morning, he would rise before the sun and tend to his garden, planting seeds with great care, watering them and nurturing them with love. But unlike the neighboring fields, his garden did not bloom in the way others expected." The disciples leaned in, their attention fully captured by the story. They knew that each word Jesus spoke carried a deeper meaning, and they were eager to understand. "The soil was hard," Jesus continued, "and no shoots emerged. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, but still nothing bloomed." The gardener's neighbors began to mock him. They would pass by and say, "Why waste your time on this barren land? It will never bear fruit. Your efforts are in vain." Jesus paused for a moment, allowing the weight of those words to settle. The disciples could feel the sting of the gardener's experience, imagining themselves in his place, working tirelessly without seeing any results. But the gardener, Jesus said, his eyes twinkling with understanding, was a man of great patience. He did not plant for a quick harvest, nor did he seek the approval of those around him. He knew that the seeds he had planted were not ordinary, and that what he was nurturing beneath the surface could not be rushed. He trusted that in time the soil would give way to life. The disciples exchanged glances, a flicker of realization dawning on them. They had often felt like the gardener, working, waiting, and wondering if their faith would ever bear fruit. James, who had been silently listening, suddenly spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "Master, are we like that gardener? Waiting for the kingdom even when it feels so far away?" Jesus turned to James, his gaze filled with love. "Yes, James. Each of you is like that gardener. The seeds of faith you plant today may not bloom tomorrow or the next day. Sometimes you may wonder if they will ever bloom at all. But know this, what you are nurturing within your hearts, though unseen for a time, is growing. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the quiet nurturing of trust in the Father's plan. The disciples sat in silence, reflecting on the truth of Jesus' words. How often had they felt impatient, wanting the kingdom to come swiftly, wanting the miracles and victories to appear without delay. They had followed Jesus, witnessed his miracles, and still they struggled with the uncertainty of waiting. As the years passed, Jesus continued, drawing them back into the story. The gardener's hair turned gray, and his hands became worn from his labor. Yet still no flowers bloomed. The people in his village began to avoid his garden, calling it cursed. Some felt pity for him while others laughed behind his back. They could not understand why he continued to work on land that gave him nothing in return. The disciples felt a pang of empathy for the gardener. They too had faced ridicule and doubt from others, questioning their commitment to a journey that seemed uncertain. The pressure to prove themselves, to show the world the fruits of their faith, had weighed heavily on them at times. But the gardener never wavered, Jesus said, his voice steady and sure. He continued to tend to the soil, watering it each day, pulling out the weeds and speaking to the seeds buried deep beneath the surface. Though there was no visible sign of life, the gardener knew that something was happening beneath the soil, something that could not be rushed. Peter, who had often struggled with impatience, felt a lump rise in his throat. He remembered the many times he had doubted, the times he had pushed for immediate results, not understanding that the waiting was part of the journey. His voice trembled as he asked, "Master, how did the gardener find the strength to keep going when everyone else had given up on him?" Jesus smiled, his eyes full of compassion. The gardener's strength came from his faith, Peter. He believed in the promise of the harvest, even when there was no evidence of it. He understood that patience is not weakness. It is a strength that grows when we place our trust in something greater than ourselves. The gardener was not waiting idly. He was nurturing, preparing, and believing. Peter's eyes filled with tears. He had often misunderstood patience, seeing it as a passive surrender rather than an active faith. In that moment, he realized that patience required more strength than he had ever imagined. Jesus continued, his voice filled with quiet power. One day, after many years of tending to the soil, the first bud appeared, small, fragile, yet full of life. And then another and another. Soon, the garden burst into bloom with flowers more radiant and resilient than anyone had ever seen. These flowers were not ordinary. They had withstood years of patience, nurtured by love and faith. The villagers who had once mocked the gardener were left speechless. They realized that while they had hurried through life, chasing quick rewards, the gardener had waited, and in his waiting, he had cultivated something far more extraordinary. The disciples felt the weight of the story settle deep into their hearts. They could see the beauty of the gardener's perseverance, the quiet strength it took to trust in something unseen for so long. They realized that their own journey with Jesus was much like the gardener's, filled with moments of doubt, but also with the promise of something greater than they could yet see. Tears welled up in Peter's eyes. "Master, I've often doubted. I've wanted things to happen now. I didn't understand that the waiting was part of the gift. I wanted to see the kingdom come right away." Jesus placed his hand on Peter's shoulder, his touch filled with love. "Peter, the greatest rewards come not from rushing through life, but from trusting in the Father's timing. Patience is not the absence of action, it is the quiet nurturing of trust. And trust, Peter, is what makes your heart ready to receive the fullness of God's promises." At this, Peter's tears spilled over, but they were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of relief, of release. The burden he had carried, the pressure to make things happen quickly, lifted from him. He felt light, as though a weight he hadn't even realized was there had been gently removed. Jesus looked at his disciples with warmth and love. His eyes shone with the understanding of their struggles, their hopes, and their fears. "My friends," he said softly, "just as a garden only blooms with time, so do the blessings of your life. The Father's plan is like a garden, and though you may not always see the blooms, trust that they are growing in ways you cannot yet perceive. The flowers of faith, of love, of patience. They are all being nurtured in the soil of your soul. In time, your patience will be met with a beauty beyond anything you can imagine. The disciples nodded, their hearts full of hope and peace. Each of them felt a deep sense of renewal, as if a fresh wind had blown through their spirits. They understood now that their journey with Jesus was not just about the destination, but about the lessons they learned along the way, the lessons of faith, trust, and most importantly, patience. Let's now expand the narrative further by adding emotional backstories, reflections, and more detailed interactions among the disciples and Jesus to give the story depth and even more emotional resonance. Here's the continuation. As the disciples reflected on the story, the weight of its meaning began to settle into their hearts. They thought about their own struggles with impatience, the times they had questioned their path, their purpose. Each of them carried memories of moments where they had felt defeated by the weight, by the uncertainty. Matthew, who had once been a tax collector, remembered the years he had spent accumulating wealth, thinking that riches would satisfy the void in his heart. He had believed that if he worked harder, collected more, he would finally find contentment. But it wasn't until he met Jesus that he understood true wealth did not come from material possessions. Now, hearing the story of the gardener, he realized that the growth he sought in his own soul was much like the flowers in the barren garden. It would come, but only with patience and faith. "Master," Matthew said quietly, "I used to think that everything could be earned quickly, that the harder I worked, the faster I would achieve my goals. But now I see that some things of true value, cannot be rushed. They grow only with time." Jesus nodded, his eyes full of compassion for Matthew's journey. "You have learned well, Matthew. The treasures of the heart, the treasures of the kingdom, are not like the treasures of this world. They cannot be stored up in barns or measured in gold. They grow slowly, often unnoticed, but when they bloom, they are worth far more than any earthly riches." Matthew felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had spent so many years chasing after the wrong kind of wealth, but now he understood that the most valuable things in life were the ones that required time, patience, and faith. Thomas, who was known for his doubts, was struggling with the message in his own way. He had always needed proof, something tangible to hold on to. Waiting for something unseen, trusting in something that had not yet come to pass, was difficult for him. His mind wrestled with the idea of patience, of believing in a promise that had no immediate evidence. "Master," Thomas said hesitantly, what if the flowers never bloom? What if we wait and we trust, and in the end there is no reward?" Jesus turned to Thomas, his expression gentle but firm. "Thomas, faith is not about guarantees. It is about trust. The flowers may not bloom in the way you expect or in the time you desire, but they will bloom in the way the Father has ordained. Your task is not to demand the outcome, but to nurture the soil, to tend to the seeds, and to trust that in time the harvest will come." Thomas lowered his head, his doubts still lingering, but a new seed of trust was being planted in his heart. He didn't fully understand, but he was beginning to see that patience wasn't just about waiting. It was about trusting that even in the silence, even in the moments when nothing seemed to be happening, God was at work. As the sun continued to rise higher in the sky, Jesus stood and motioned for the disciples to follow him. They walked together, their feet crunching softly against the earth as they made their way back down the hillside. The barren patch of land still lay in the center of the valley, but now, it seemed to the disciples to hold a different kind of beauty. They no longer saw it as a wasteland but as a place of potential, a place where something extraordinary was quietly taking root beneath the surface. "Master," John said as they walked, "what should we do while we wait? How can we keep our hearts from growing weary in the waiting?" Jesus stopped and turned to face his beloved disciple. "John, the waiting is not a time of idleness. It is a time of preparation. Just as the gardener tended to his soil, so too must you tend to your hearts. Spend your time in prayer, in acts of love, in service to others. The waiting is not wasted if it is filled with faith. Every moment of patience is a moment in which your heart is being prepared for the harvest." John nodded, feeling a deep sense of purpose rise within him. He realized that the waiting was not something to be endured, it was something to be embraced. It was in the waiting that his faith would grow, that his love for others would deepen, and that his heart would be prepared for the blessings to come. The group continued their walk in silence, each disciple lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the lesson they had just learned. The beauty of the valley surrounded them, but their eyes kept returning to the barren garden, which now seemed to hold an almost sacred significance. They knew that one day, it too would bloom just as their own lives would bloom in time. As they reached the foot of the hill, Jesus stopped once more and turned to his disciples, his eyes full of love and wisdom. "Remember this, my friends," he said softly. "The greatest rewards come not from rushing through life, but from trusting in the Father's timing. Patience is not the absence of action, it is the quiet nurturing of trust. And trust, my beloved friends, is what makes your hearts ready to receive the fullness of God's promises." The disciples stood there, letting the words wash over them, filling their hearts with hope, peace, and a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, that there would be times of waiting, times of doubt, times when they would wonder if the flowers would ever bloom. But now they understood that the waiting was not in vain. It was part of the journey, part of the growth, part of the blessing. And so, with hearts full of faith, they followed their Master, ready to continue their journey, knowing that in time, the garden of their souls would bloom with a beauty beyond anything they could imagine. The hillside grew quiet again, except for the soft rustle of the wind in the trees, carrying with it the gentle promise that all things in their time would come to pass. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.